Hello, and welcome to Lecture 18 of AMAT502 at UAlbany. Today, we're going to proceed in shortening our lectures at least a bit so that we can focus on the actual mechanics of doing data science. And today, I'm going to go ahead and summarize for you the sort of data science pipeline at a high level and illustrate it on one of the most important data sets in data science, namely the MNIST handwritten digit data set. So I'm going to give you a broad overview of what this pipeline looks like. Pipeline, you just want to think of it as a sequence of steps that you follow. Along the way, we're going to get into a question of how do we evaluate how good a clustering schema is? Because we're going to work in a situation where one could conceivably apply both clustering and classification. We're going to look at the actual notion of a pipeline as it's written into scikit-learn. And see how that's used by combining PCA and Kmeans. And then we're going to compare clustering with classification in this situation. So at a high level, you can think of the data science pipeline as consisting of anywhere from 4 to 5 steps. I guess counting with 0, we're actually looking at 5 to 6 steps. The first step is always going to be how do you collect or load your data? By relying on a famous already established case of a data science problem, we really don't have to do as much of the collection process, and we just focus on loading the data. The next step is going to be exploring our data, and this is sometimes called exploratory data analysis. You just want to look at it and see what might be a good thing to use. And that is what informs your step 2, which is what machine learning methods do you want to use? And we're going to focus on traditional machine learning rather than just passing it off to a neural net. Then finally, we get into the mechanics of actually applying Python and creating instances of our data science methods, which really amounts to creating instances of these classes, at least in the object-oriented view of programming. And that's what we're going to use to train our data on. And it's what we end up using then in test or evaluate the quality of our methods. That's all part of step 4, which is analyzing the results. And finally, step 5, we'll ask, maybe we missed something really simple and that we should have actually done a little bit of pre-processing to help improve our results. And the examples we're going to consider today, the kind of pre-processing steps might not actually help you, but it might actually help you a lot, as we saw in our live lecture when we looked at the wine data set. At a high level, we're going to consider 2 different methods. So this is going to correspond to 2 different choices of what to do in step 2. We're going to try PCA and K-means on the MNIST data set. And this follows a really lovely presentation, which I found here, again, via Kaggle, which has lots of really nice visualization techniques. And then we're going to apply straight up KNN, K nearest neighbors. Okay, so as a quick reminder, the MNIST data set is really quite famous. In its largest form, I think, consists of well over 10 or even 50,000 handwritten digits. And the question is, how do we actually perform digit recognition automatically? So meaning instead of using our human eyes to look at digits, we're going to teach a computer to do this sort of digit identification for us. Of course, this might be a very useful application for the post office, which needs to automatically read a bunch of letters, see where people are addressing their letters to, and then passing them and sorting them on automatically. You can see how complicated this task might be. For example, this 8, which is just a blob, we still recognize as an 8, but it loses all of its usual features of having a loop. But it does have the sort of broad shape on the outside. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and load a bunch of libraries all at the start. In this case, I don't think we actually need our data sets, but this step can already take a little while if we're doing a lot of different metrics. I believe this one might be optional, so let me just go ahead and comment that. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with our steps in the data science pipeline. So the first step is we want to load and inspect the MNIST data set. So for this lecture, I'm actually giving you some locally stored CSV files, just with the idea that, you know, one day you're not just going to have data sets handed to you from Kaggle or the UC Irvine machine learning repository. Instead, you're going to be looking at some data that was specially collected for you to do your job. So let's go ahead and look through this and have a look at what's going on here. So I'm gonna comment out some of these lines here, so that we can just get a sense of what this sort of test CSV file looks like. And you can see I said it I'm telling pandas to read in this small MNIST test CSV file, but you know, this seems really sort of messy. In particular, it's got hard-coded row numbers, which corresponds actually to the number of digits. So it's got 2,000 rows and 786 columns. But there's actually a repetition of this row, of this column here. So we know that we don't really need that. But we might ask ourselves, well, what are some of these other entries? So for example, if I look at this entry corresponding to 1, what does this look like? I mean, just by visual inspection, we see that we've got a 7, a 2, a 1, a 0, a 4, a 1, 6, 3, 9, 5, 6. So the hypothesis that I have here is that this column here actually encodes the actual class label of our MNIST data set. So let's try to look at that. And we see that we do have a bunch of integers between 0 and 9, which is what we'd expect for the MNIST data set. All right, so with all that said, we know that we're going to drop our columns, and then let's go ahead and look at test again. And so things are looking a lot nicer. We've got pandas already gives us this indexing of the rows, but then we've got our column levels with no further header information. Notice it sort of pre-populated the first row and just went ahead and made that most of our column. So either way, we can forget that for now and just move on with our data set. And of course, you always want to ask things like, well, what's the shape of this data set? If we look at the training shape, we see that it's 10,000 by 785. Now, you might ask yourself, what is 785 all about? Well, if we go ahead and do this sort of calculation, so we want to think of these as actually square images. You can see that 784 properly would be 28. So that means that our images consist of 28 by 28 image 28 by 28 pixel images of handwritten digits. So that's still pretty remarkable because it means we're looking at 10,000 points in a 784 dimensional space once we've pulled out this class label and focused just on the features, which is the intensity of each of these grayscale image patches. All right, so very often, if we want to evaluate the quality of our methods, we need to do what's called the train test split. And so in this case, we can basically go ahead and pick off some of our values, and we're going to go ahead and pass this in terms of NumPy arrays. And then our Y train, remember this corresponds to the actual entry that's sitting inside that first column, so we're going to call that 0. So we've got essentially that first element there, first column, and then all the columns after 0 and onwards actually contains all the feature data. Again, you're going to need to do some inspection to see what's right for your application. But remember, you can always do these sorts of interactive locator and slicing in order to access these elements. So we've gone ahead and brought this into memory, and of course, I already had pulled out my train and test data sets, loaded as CSV files, and now here I'm separating out what's the sort of independent variables, those are feature vectors, and what's the dependent. In this case, it's sort of our class label. So now let's try to downsample this data set because we don't necessarily want to work with all 10,000 points. Often that can be computationally very expensive, especially when we're doing PCA. So we'll even just start by cutting our data set in half. So here we're going to look at 5,000 digits, and don't worry about this n digits yet. It's gonna be important later. But our training data set, we're going to slice and just go ahead and take the first 5,000 samples or rows from that. All right, so let's go ahead and do our step one. Step one is going to be performing some initial data exploration via visualization. So again, we as humans, like one of our most important attributes is our ability to look at things and reason spatially. And so if there's ever clear structure when we visualize our data, we should try to use that information when applying our methods. So let's go ahead and even look further at the first 1,000 digits. And I'll just note that this slicing at either the first 5,000 or even now the first 1,000 samples all seems pretty well justified because our MNIST data set seemed to give us a sort of random order of digits. You know, it said we had a 6, a 4, a 1, a 2, and so on. If we, of course, had our data ordered, then we wouldn't want to just truncate. We'd want to use some sort of randomized method to pick out things. So here we're going to use some of Matplotlib's toolkits, including how to plot in 3 dimensions. And so let's first look at taking first 5 principal components. We're just going to use it on the first 1,000 digits of X. All right, and so if we do that, we get this very nice plot. But of course, if you went ahead and used some of these fancier libraries, then we could have done some fancier visualization. It's not clear whether or not we have access or can install all these yet, but you know, it shouldn't prevent yourself from downloading your own version of Anaconda and trying to follow this. All right, so the sort of lesson from this pass is there doesn't seem to be a lot of structure. I mean, we've got this, you know, sort of blob. Maybe it looks like there's sort of a lima bean shape in there, which seems to be somewhat conformed by the fact that there's sort of denser points around here, which just indicates that they're in this sort of projection. There seems to be some sort of folding behavior. But regardless, we've done our due diligence, we've looked at the data, and beyond basic visualization, you want to now start thinking about, well, what methods should I use on my data set? So I want you to think of there being a hierarchy of methods. And very often you should start with the simplest tools and only proceed to fancier tools when necessary. And so what are the simplest or coarsest invariants of any data science task? Well, I would argue that, especially when we're not doing prediction in the sort of numerical case, when we're not doing regression, my apologies, then we want to be looking at just basic classification or clustering. Both of these are sort of decomposing our sets into groups. One is done sort of intrinsically without labels. That's what's done in clustering. The other is sort of classification. We're in supervised machine learning. We have some preset list of labels that we're trying to hit. But this is sort of the coarsest invariant that we should try to attack first. Once you've done this, you can then move on to considering more continuous methods. Like, maybe I can sort of figure out exactly what the shape is of this data set, which would amount to doing some sort of regression, or even in its sort of fancier, more unsupervised form, we have this notion of manifold learning. Manifold learning is sort of a concept that comes from differential geometry and now brought into data science. Sometimes goes underneath the heading of nonlinear dimensionality reduction. And so basically, you just want to be able to try to figure out how your data is parameterized in sort of continuous ways and deal with sort of nonlinearity like that. Okay. So before we get to those fancier methods, again, we want to start with more primitive methods. So the question is, should we use clustering or should we use classification? And again, we don't always have a choice, but in the MNIST data set, we do have a choice. So as a quick reminder, classification is always easier because someone's already telling us what the labels or classes should be. That means when we're trying to evaluate how good our models are, the step of this in our train model predict paradigm, we can always assess it accuracy much more easily just by counting the percentage of correct predictions. So we make a prediction and then we assume it's revealed to us what's the true class label, and then we either get a point or we lose a point. But nevertheless, we're going to want to use clustering because there's something principled about asking, are our classes well defined, in the sense that did our classes emerge from actual structure in, say, the space of handwritten digits? And this is why it's worth considering clustering or unsupervised methods, because this sort of grounds us to see, is this structure that exists out in the world and isn't necessarily created based on our human imaginations. But this is so much more difficult. And for sort of an understanding of why, I like these two quotes from Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning, A Probabilistic Perspective. And so he quotes two authors, Jane and Dubes, from a 1988 article. It says, the validation of clustering structures is the most difficult and frustrating part of cluster analysis. Without a strong effort in this direction, cluster analysis will remain a black art accessible only to those true believers who have experience and great courage. Sounds very lofty, but the perhaps simpler way to say it is that clustering is an unsupervised learning technique, so it is hard to evaluate the quality of the output of any given method. But again, there's a lot of good reason to think we should try to do this, and this is an area of active research. We're trying to figure out how good is our clustering schema, and we're doing this when we're not given or considering the labels. So let's see how this works out in K-means. And so just as a reminder, remember that K-means clustering was a solution to a constrained optimization problem. We defined this notion of variability within a cluster, and then we summed up this variability to give this sort of dissimilarity notion of a clustering. And the task was to partition our data that minimizes this function. But we found out that that problem is not well posed, or at least has a trivial solution by partitioning every point into its own cluster. And so the K in K-means again says, let's go ahead and try to constrain our optimization problem to the setting where the clusters only have K different clusters. And if we assume the number of points is larger than K, then we have an interesting problem. But of course, if we go ahead and try to convert the sort of clustering labels, and again, the output of K-means clustering, as we're seeing in our projects, is some integer between 0 and K-1. That then gives us an instance of labeling. And then we can ask, well, if we are dealing with labeled data, so we are in a supervised learning problem, but we try to use unsupervised learning techniques, we can always compare by figuring out some sort of notion of sort of purity in order to match what are our cluster labels the same or different from the class labels up to permutation, because the cluster labels produced by the algorithms are sort of chosen at random, as we introduced the first time we looked at k-means. All right, so this is a very important topic that's going to be pertinent to the k-means project that we've been looking at. So we're looking at how do we assess the purity of a clustering. So this is a situation we're trying to cluster even though we have labeled data. So let's define some notation. So let's let Nij be the number of objects in cluster I that belong to class J. Okay. And then let Ni be the total number of objects in cluster I. So we sum over all of our class labels, J equals 1 to C, or C is our number of class labels. And then we let that be the total number of objects in cluster I, this Ni. So this number Pij, which is Nij divided by Ni, this is really just a frequency distribution. So it essentially says what percentage of my objects in cluster I belong to each of these different classes. So in an ideal world, we would have some sort of clustering which perfectly replicates our classification. And in this setting, this amounts to effectively asking if this ends up being, this percentage is completely concentrated with into some cluster label or class, or with one single class label. All right, so let's remember that Pij is the percentage of objects in cluster I that actually belong to class J. Okay. So if we go through and we look at all the different class labels that we have, class labels J, then we can define the purity as the most frequent appearance of objects inside of my clustering. And so this gives us a notion of a purity of a single cluster inside of a clustering. So we define a cluster as being just one subset in our partition defined by a clustering. And then of course, how do we evaluate the overall purity of our clustering? So this means we've got different clusters that belong to our clustering. We can go ahead and just consider the weighted average. So we take our Pi, which is our max, and then we just consider, well, what number of objects is in that cluster. That's Ni divided by the total number of points inside of N. So this just essentially gives a weighted average of each of our purities. So this is the purity of a cluster, and this is the overall purity of our clustering. This is so much easier once we consider a picture. So this is a situation where we've got samples, and these samples are labeled. So this, again, means we're in a supervised learning scenario. So we've got a bunch of points that happen to have the label A. Got a bunch of points. So let's count them actually. So we've got 6 points. Sorry, pardon me. We have 6 plus 2 A's. So we have 8 A's, and then we've got 4 B's, and then we got 4 C's. And so we think of that as being our instance of labeled data. We've got our total of, we count this up, so there's 6 plus 6 is 12, plus 5 is 17. So we have 17 points classified into 3 classes, A, B, and C. And then we're asking, suppose I have some clustering schema that partitions this into 3 things. And notice we have 3 is the same number class labels we have. And here we've got a cluster which consists almost exclusively of A's. We have another cluster which consists almost exclusively of Bs, but we have two exceptions. And then we've got another cluster which is largely Cs. So 3 out of 5 points in this are C. And so this would give us reason to believe that our clustering schema has been able to rediscover our classification, and that maybe we should even question our classification if we trusted this clustering. But let's go ahead and figure it out. What's the overall purity of this clustering? Well, if we were to look at this frequency table, this is our empirical distribution on class labels in cluster 1. Well, we would say there's 6 points, 5/6 of them are A's, 1/6 of them are B's, and 0.6 of them are C's. So we take the max of all these PIJs, now I's, we're looking at cluster 1, so I equals 1. Then we'd have 5/6 is my purity of my first cluster. Now let's go to my second cluster. So now I'm looking at my I equals 2. So my distribution says, well, 1 out of 6 of my elements in my second cluster are A. 4/6 or 2/3 of my elements are of class B, and 1/6 are of class C. And so again, we take the maximum of the frequencies, or what's the most common. We say that, that's B, we got 4/6. So that gives me the purity of cluster 2 is 4/6 pure, 2/3 pure. And then in this third cluster, if I were to do my empirical distribution, I'd say that 2/5 are A's, 0.5 are B's, and 3/5 are C's. And so my purity of cluster 3 is 3/5. And so if I now take the weighted average, where I weight by the percentage of samples that are in each of those clusters, then I will get 6/17 times 5/6, corresponding to the fact that 6 out of 17 points are here. I got 6 out of 17 points in cluster 2, and then 5 out of 17 points in cluster 3. So this gives me an overall purity score for this clustering of 0.71. All right, we've got some code that essentially computes this later, but it's important to understand the math. All right, so let's go ahead and put all this into some code, and then let's look at some plotting functions that are particular to the MNIST data set. All right, so these are essentially auxiliary functions that I borrowed from one of these other demonstrations. But the key thing is going to be these cluster stats. And we're going to go through, and we've got a combination of things, cluster stats and clusters purity. And so I encourage you to sort of think about this in a little more careful detail. I believe this is borrowed from our Guttag MIT book. Yes, so this has our notion of clustering in here. And so let's go ahead and write this up, and we'll go through understanding this in more detail later. But we brought these functions into memory. And so let's now go ahead and apply PCA and K-means. So again, we're dealing with a situation where we're only looking at half of our training data, so that's 5,000. And so we're just going to truncate, get the first 5,000 digits, and then we're going to try to do clustering in 8 dimensions, which means our data is normally in 784 dimensions. It's huge. But by doing principal component analysis, PCA, we can project this down to the most important or significant components. In this case, we'll do it to the first 8 most significant components. And then there's where we'll apply K-means. Because K-means inside of this 8-dimensional space can be much better behaved than inside of our 784-dimensional space. So let's go ahead and go through some of this. You'll notice that here we're using a feature of the scikit-learn pipeline where we can essentially link together, like in a chain, principal component analysis, and then K-means. And you'll remember that earlier we defined in digits to be 10. So probably should just go ahead and bring that here. So in digits, 10. So good. All right, so now we've created our predictor object. Our predictor object is now part of this class pipeline, which means that we've actually chained together two different data science methods, Kmeans and PCA, and then we've gone ahead and do the whole predict and fit. So just get a sense of what are the attributes of this predictor object. So again, now we have our 5,000 points, and it's now predicted at least something about, or it's put into these clusters, each of these 5,000 points. So let's see what happens when we now try to analyze the results. This is step 4 in our pipeline. My apologies, I meant to put this out on a separate slide, but let's just go ahead and I'll back into this briefly. Slide, and I'll make this a fragment. All right. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at this. All right, so now, okay, so it's still running. All right, beautiful. So this is essentially what some of these auxiliary functions have done. What they were doing is essentially reading in our CSV file and then turning them back into images we could stare at in order to better analyze how good our clustering techniques were. And so you'll notice that there's already some interesting some aspects of this analysis. So it created a bunch of clusters, and we said the number of clusters should be 10, which is the number of digits between 0 through 9. And this first cluster essentially nailed it. It seems to have automatically picked out the zeros as their own cluster, with only a few mistakes. So there are 289 elements of this cluster. The majority of them, so this indicates our most pure, is 0. But you'll see that we have a 5 here, which my computer went ahead and thought was, looked like a 0. So it clustered this 5 in with a bunch of zeros. This cluster is much more jagged. You can see that just a little over half of points belong to a single labeled point, and this is the 1 class. But you can see we also have some 5s, we have some 6s, we have some 9s, and so forth. This cluster is sort of horrible. We've only got 263, so less than half belong to the 4 class. And so when we consider this empirical distribution on classes inside of this cluster, you know, our most popular thing was a 4, but there were plenty of other things like 3s and 7s and 9s. So we've got 0 cluster, a cluster that consists mostly of 1s, but also has a bunch of other things. Cluster that's hardly dominated by anything, but happens to have a lot of 4s in it. And then we've also got this, this cluster consisting largely of 9s, but again, not even majority. There's also a lot of 4s. And so if you go through this and you sort of stare at this in more careful detail, you'll see that there's another cluster also of a bunch of 0s and 5s. And so even though I asked for 10 clusters, hoping that maybe K-means would rediscover our notion of handwritten digits, it actually didn't. And in fact, what it went ahead and did is created a couple clusters, each which had mostly 0s in them. But it did pick out some other things, like we've got a lot of 2s here. Well, that's nice. And we also have a lot of 7s here. And we also have a lot of 6s here and a lot of 8s here. So this somehow suggested that 8s, 6s, 2s, 7s, 3s, all are really principled clusters. But then 9s and 4s really aren't that different. And similarly, 1/7s, and it looks like, yeah, maybe even 5s. So all of this is just supposed to say that from a machine's perspective, we can actually sort of confuse those digits, even though we know that we have some well-defined class labels, just because our human eyes are able to inspect these. Okay, so I'll just mention that step 5, it's one we're not going to execute here in this lecture, but we will do it in the live lecture. It's considering maybe there were some pre-processing steps that we could have done. One of the most common examples that we'll like to use, and we'll really see it succeed in some other methods, is this rescaling, where we can basically scale our inputted data in such a way that mean centers and then also sort of tries to essentially put variance close to 1, which is a standard trick. And then, but in this case, actually, applying this pre-processing step would make our classification worse. But let's hopefully we can see that in class. All right, so I just gave you sort of a somewhat long-winded guide through how do we combine PCA, K-means, how do we evaluate the notion of cluster purity, can we rediscover the actual classes which exist in looking at handwritten digits. So meaning our digits sort of really well-defined external from our human eyes. And the answer is that maybe 60% of them are. That was our overall purity, something like 60%. Let's compare this with K and N. So K nearest neighbors, as a reminder, picks a point, looks at all the K closest points, and then votes. So here you're using labeled data very heavily. And probably shouldn't be surprised, this is going to perform a lot better. Let's go ahead and see that. So the rough schema here is, we've got our X, which if you recall was the first 5,000 digits. Again, we already truncated it, this N equals 5,000. So now let's run the K nearest neighbors classifier. So we're going to create an instance of this class where the number of neighbors we look at is 5. It's going to be our K and N object. And we're going to fit it. And here we have to pass it both X, which is the features of this grayscale image, and Y, which is actually the class label. And then you can predict using the test data. And so this is the situation where we take a point, which is now viewed as this image, need to evaluate, is it actually, what would we predict it to be by counting its nearest neighbors. So to do that, it could take a little bit of a while because we're still looking at 5,000 points in some 784 dimensional space. And as you can see, it's still running. All right, finally finished. I hope this doesn't crash our Jupyter server. All right, and now let's go ahead and look at some of the accuracy. So again, notice we didn't have to do any fancy math when looking with the supervised learning technique. We just had labeled data and we asked what % of the time did we get it right? And somewhat amazingly, without doing any pre-processing, working on KNN and 784 dimensional space, where you'd think that this curse of dimensionality might actually really blow things up for you, still got 90%. That's pretty amazing. Very, very simple classification, ended up getting 90%. But if you look at the MNIST data set, you'll see that some of the innovators of this, their first step was to use something like SVM, which they got about an 8% error rate. So they even did better with 92. But if you do some KNN with some other methods, you can end up getting down even lower. So almost close to a 90, well, about a 99% accuracy rate. And so very often the name of the game in data science is trying to like drive this accuracy rate up even by 0.1%, because that can be that much more useful or profitable. But either way, still pretty good. So let's go ahead and look at the confusion matrix. So this gives you an indication of what digits tended to be classified or misclassified amongst our test data set. So notice that, remember, we had 2,000 digits in our test data set. And you can see that it seemed to do best at predicting zeros. Our twos were even better. Eights were pretty good. But again, our sevens and our fives each seem to give it some trouble. But again, the miracle of having labeled data, it's really what helps drive these supervised learning techniques and their success. But also because we have a well-defined notion of success. So I hope you enjoy this lecture and appreciate the more guided tour. I'll ask you to go ahead and think about how you might try to evaluate the accuracy of some other unsupervised techniques in terms of like, how do we actually estimate the true dimension like we do with PCA? Each of these lead to very careful and hopefully thought-provoking questions. But that's it for today. I look forward to seeing you in class soon.